Colonel, how telling is it when arguably the leading neocon in the country, Robert Kagan, the other half of the Kagan-Victoria Nuland marriage, can write in the Atlantic that Iran has effectively defeated the United States and Israel?
Well, I think on one level, he's mourning the death of the host that he as a parasite has infested for years. This is someone who is always in search of a place to commit U.S. military power, money, and capability. So now he's finally found something that we are incapable of mastering, and it's no longer possible to disguise. And so he's essentially dismissing the United States, its armed forces, its people, as unworthy of further support from Robert Kagan. What a great man.
Man, I can't help but feel your sarcasm, and I agree with everything you've said, but it must be telling when someone like he is willing to throw in the towel. Do U.S. and Israeli planners and leaders recognize this? The president certainly hasn't.
Well, I think without a doubt, they certainly have. But I think President Trump probably lives in a bubble of his own making, and people are very reluctant to pull him out of the bubble. Now, that doesn't mean he doesn't suspect that, he's hit a concrete reinforced wall that he can't penetrate. I think he probably knows that, but he refuses to convey the impression that he hasn't won this war. I think his problem is, frankly, one of bluff. Most of what he does, if you watch him carefully in foreign policy, but here at home as well, is an exercise in psychological bluff. He wants the outward show of success, and he's managed that to some extent and struggles with weak, inconstant leaders in Europe, and I would argue in Venezuela to a limited extent. But when he employed the bluff against Iran, it failed, and his bluff is being called. He never expected this. This is hard for him to imagine. So that's why I've tried to tell people that Project Freedom was abandoned in favor of a new project called Project Nowhere. His game of power and coercion on behalf of Israel has reached its limits. He's lost the strategic initiative. It's not difficult to understand why, but he never understood what he was up against. He didn't understood the limitations of what he has. One of the things, we've talked about this before, that distinguished Eisenhower from all of his successors is having lived through the Second War and then gotten to know what it took to wage that war. Eisenhower always had a very acute sense of American limitations. He understood that the American people were not interested in, nor would they sustain a long, brutal war. That was simply an impossibility. He also understood that World War II had effectively tapped us out. And people don't realize that we reached a point where we were running out of manpower to send overseas. So the bottom line is that there was never a sense of limitations with Trump. He felt as though he was the child that broke into the candy store and he could eat as much as he liked and no one would interrupt him. It hasn't worked.
You refer to him as surrounded by a bubble. It's a bubble of sycophants. I mean, we keep hearing these stories that General Kane, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the vice president might not have been part of the sycophant group and might have expressed opinions to him contrary to what he got from Secretary Rubio, Secretary Hegseth, and the others. I don't need to mention all of their...
Well, actually speaking, Judge, I spoke over the weekend to some people in the White House, and they said the opposite. There was no one more enthusiastic about going to war with Iran than J.D. Vance. And that's my own experience with him. I saw this up close and personal, and he was always talking about going to war with Iran. So I don't believe that.
Wow.
As far as
that's consistent with his financial benefactor, Peter Thiel and Palantir, and those
absolutely
people that make a fortune on these wars.
And when it comes to Kane, we've discussed that before. He was not appointed and made a 4-star to say no. And he's an airman. And I think, like most airmen, he was more than willing to give it a go because they thought this might be another opportunity to win a war with air power only. Of course, that's nonsense, as we both know. But nevertheless, I'm very skeptical of these attempts to sort of retrospectively confer a degree of credibility and character on these people when I didn't see much evidence for it to begin with.
Well, that is of profound intellectual honesty and deeply appreciated here. And I guess I've fallen a little bit to the PR view that Vance has thought of himself as the loyal soldier, but the dissenter up to the point of the decision to go in. But I accept very much what you said. How could they have?
Before we leave this topic completely, I think it's worth pointing out that right now, behind the scenes, at least I'm being told this, that the argument is that President Trump was misled by his quote unquote Israeli friends. And that had he paid more attention to his American advisors, the narrative goes, then events might have taken a different course. But the truth is, there's a mountain of evidence that, like President Lyndon Johnson, Trump and his inner circle, including Vance, were really driving military action and escalation from the beginning. And Trump seems to have rejected advice from anyone in or out of uniform who opposed it. But very few people that opposed what he wanted to do ever got to the White House, if any. And I think that's your point on the bubble.
Yeah. So the bubble is almost literally a bubble with nobody on the inside to express the prevailing view.
Yes.
And if a person harbored internal objections over this, they lacked the personal fortitude, use another phrase if you want, to say anything to the president's face. Add to that this craziness that they think they can win a war, disrupt a regime, cause regime change, degrade the ballistic missiles, seize the nuclear enriched material, and if you listen to Netanyahu, divide the country, all on the basis of air power.
Well, I think that we developed a lot of self-delusion in the 90s. We involved ourselves in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And at one point, we bombed the Serbs in and around Sarajevo and convinced ourselves that this was the dramatic turning point. When in reality, at the time, I was on the ground in Bosnia and I was talking to British and French officers that were involved. And they pointed out to me in great detail that the British and French artillery had done infinitely more damage with greater precision than the airstrikes. So I sort of tucked that away. But if you go back to Holbrooke, who was the ambassador at the time that Clinton had appointed to deal with all of this, he became a huge advocate for the use of air power. That was his sort of favorite topic. Then we get into Kosovo, and it was made very clear to General Clark that he could have whatever he wanted, do whatever he wanted. Obviously not nuclear weapons, but that never ever came up for discussion anyway. But he wasn't going to get any ground force. And so whatever he did, he had to accomplish with air power. Well, he accomplished a great deal, but it wasn't enough. And ultimately, we had to send Strobe Talbot to Moscow and bribe the Russians to abandon their Serb friends, at which point in time, the Serbs realized they weren't going to get any coal or oil or food or medical support of any kind during the winter that was coming. So he said, either I get out now or I'll face a winter and hundreds of thousands of Serbs will die. But it wasn't exclusively by any stretch of imagination because of air power, but the story was spun up to make people believe that air power had been successful. And then when you move on to the Middle East, to Iraq, the Iraqis were many things, but they were never, 10 feet tall, even though people described them that way. And the Iraqis were in no position to resist us for any length of time, and it was never required to bring in a large number of ground forces. Now, the neocons understood that, but they made the fatal mistake of having once gotten there of staying. But again, I think the glossy cover to this sort of narrative of self-delusion is air power über alles. And I think Trump fell victim to it. Now everybody's backpedaling and trying to get out from under the problem, but it's not going to work. Everybody who's being part of this, Judge, is ultimately going to go down, I would say, politically for what's happened.
So, Colonel, have your friends in the White House expressed a view as to what Trump will do, and who will he blame? Will he blame Hegseth? Will he blame General Kane? Will he blame the Israelis? He's certainly not going to take blame himself. If he does, it'll be the first time in his adult life.
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and I don't have a good answer to it except to point out that there are a lot of people who are blaming the Israelis behind closed doors, but they're all afraid to say so publicly. And I think part of that is that they don't want to admit that, the Israelis have led us down the path to destruction eagerly. And in fact, Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke quite recently, just a few hours ago, as I understand it, saying that the war is not over and it must continue. And I think that's what he wants. He doesn't care what it costs us. He doesn't care what it costs the world. He doesn't care how many people starve in the global south. He doesn't care whether or not inflation is going to destroy us, along with large numbers of governments all over the world. It's irrelevant to him. He wants complete dominance, control, hegemony over the Middle East. The only way he can get it is with us. So I think, unfortunately, Trump can't blame it on the Israelis. Whether he likes it or not, he's going to be held responsible. But
can he allow Netanyahu to go it alone? And Netanyahu can't prevail alone.
No, but even the Congress, which is being very much a puppet of Israeli interests and power, much like the White House, is going to have to come to the realization that inflation in April reached 3.8%. Now, what does that mean? It means that inflation is on the rise. We can't artificially suppress it. The problem with the war, the problem with oil, with fertilizer, feedstocks, food, all of these things are metastasizing. They're getting worse and worse with each passing day. At some point, in order to disengage from this tragedy, we are going to have to divorce the Israelis in some way. And I think Netanyahu is going to hang on as long as he can, but it's going to be necessary. And even the puppets on the Hill, as well as many in the White House, are going to have to back away from Israel. That's coming. And it's also coming because, inflation of the kind that we're witnessing now, Judge, that affects the things that I mentioned, food, feedstocks, fuel, and fertilizer. This kind of thing changes governments routinely in history. I mean, you go all the way back to the French Revolution in 1789, when the population could no longer afford to buy bread. There was a revolution. It wasn't because people sat in the corner and read pamphlets and said, we need a new form of government. Absolutely not. It was simply because people could not eat. They couldn't get what they needed. I expect that over the next year, we'll see 40, 50, 60 governments around the world, certainly in Europe. We may see it very shortly in India. You have Prime Minister Modi, who is now caught in a terrible position. He didn't bring this on. He didn't ask for this problem, but now he's got it. And famine in India is a real possibility. Beyond that, he's got a power problem. India had power problems before this started. And he started in 2018 to try and fix the power grid, but it's too late. Now there's no power. A civilization cannot exist without power. That's why cheap energy is so vitally important. And to cheap energy is tied cheap credit. We're losing all of it right now. It's all going away. This disruption is going to bring down governments, and I include the Trump administration in that category.
You wrote a fascinating piece about a week or so ago arguing that wealth and power is moving east. So let me ask you a couple of questions about it. Has the war in Iran pushed Russia, Iran, and China closer together? Has the war in Iran accelerated the movement of wealth and power eastward?
Oh, absolutely, without question. Let's look at this for a second, because initially Russia, China viewed India as a potential strategic partner. But India has been unable to solve its own problems. It's been unable, so to say, to get out of its own way. Iran is very different. And in contrast to us, I think both the Chinese and the Russians viewed the Iranian state, nation, and population as strong enough to resist us. That's one of the reasons that they helped and they assisted, but the Iranians would never allow them to bring in their troops, their forces, their navy, their air force, or anything else. And the Chinese and the Russians also saw Iran at the center of this Central Asian, Eurasian landmass project known as Belt and Road. The idea being that you build this tremendous network of transportation and movement of commercial goods back and forth across the continent, all the way from Europe to Shanghai, from the west coast of Africa all the way to the east coast of China. All of this is now part of the reason for Iran's success and the confidence that now the Chinese and the Russians have in them. So what we're seeing is a reversal of what used to exist. Remember in 1492, when Columbus crossed, he discovered a new world, and very rapidly that discovery powered Europe. How did it power Europe? Mainly through the acquisition of huge quantities of gold. We had a series of empires that rose and fell, but the living standards rose. Our technology developed faster. Well, that's over. And that kind of wealth is now being generated in the place that used to be the dominant creator of wealth in human history, and that's China. China is now the wealth engine. It's the workshop of the world. It's the production center for the world. We're not happy about that, but we've ultimately squandered our wealth pointlessly and needlessly. President Trump is going to go over to China and he's going to play what he thinks are cards. He's going to look at his cards and there may be baseball cards, but they're of no value in this discussion with the Chinese.